Now that we've covered loss on ignition, let's discuss loss on drying. This is another fundamental test that most laboratories are familiar with. In this section, we'll focus on why it's important, what the risks are, how loss on drying differs from other tests, such as Carl Fisher, and what to look for if you decide to get away from using a draft oven and want something faster, such as an infrared moisture balance or rapid loss on drying analyzer. Loss on drying, similar to loss on ignition, provides a ratio of two components. In this case, it's the ratio of volatile to non-volatile components. This helps ensure consistency in drug dosage and that certain products have been sufficiently dried prior to packaging. There are many ways to calculate this ratio, but the two most common are loss on drying in the case of mostly dry products, and total solids, which is more commonly reported for mostly liquid products. The one big caveat to this whole discussion is that loss on drying, as you already know, does not differentiate between water and other volatile components. This is simply a measurement of how much weight is lost when a sample is exposed to a certain temperature. Although on the surface, loss on drying seems to pose fewer risks than loss on ignition because we're operating at much lower temperatures, typically around that 100 degrees Celsius mark, there's still some real risks associated with loss on drying methods. Because of the lower temperatures, oftentimes small molecules that are biologically reactive may be volatilized from the sample and introduced into the exhaust stream. For that reason, it's important to have a system that's designed to properly handle exhaust to avoid exposure of lab personnel to these volatile components. Just as with muffle furnaces, draft ovens reach temperatures that can cause burns, so care must be taken to avoid contact with those hot surfaces as well. In addition to risks to personal safety, there are also risks to the sample itself. Proper care must be taken to make sure that the sample is not under-dried or over-dried. If the sample is overheated and begins to burn, then solids can be driven off and you'll get erroneous results. A similar issue with under-drying samples. If there's still moisture or other volatile components left over, then results will be off as well. And whether you under-dry or over-dry your sample, as I mentioned, that is a risk to your results. So if the sample is not properly dried, errors in data can result in a best-case scenario in having to repeat that test and wait a few more hours for the repeat results, or in a worst-case scenario, rejection or reworking of product that is already in specification. So let's talk about the difference between loss on drying and Carl Fisher. I seem to get this question quite a bit from customers who ask if loss on drying is a good replacement for their Carl Fisher. These are both two very important tests, and they both serve some different functions, so we can discuss here what those differences are. For loss on drying, it is a gravimetric test. It's not specific, meaning if it volatilizes, it counts. So any volatile component that is driven off of that sample will be counted as a loss on drying. There are no reagents required. It's simply a change in mass after being exposed to heat. And the nice thing about loss on drying is it's relatively easy to perform. Carl Fisher, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It is a titration method. It is specific to water, so this will differentiate between water specifically and other volatile components. It requires the storage and disposal of reagents and a little bit higher level of staff expertise, so it's not quite as simple as loss on drying to perform. So that's the trade-off in being able to specifically quantify water. And it's somewhat difficult to perform manually, but there are a lot of automated instruments on the market that make the process fairly easy to perform. We'll focus on loss on drying for the purposes of this discussion. We'll leave Carl Fisher behind. So looking at loss on drying, we look at loss on drying reference methods. If you read through USP methods or ISO methods, you'll see that they all require a drying oven of some sort, whether that's a draft oven or a vacuum oven. But if you've been out in the workplace for very long, what you'll realize is that most companies opt for rapid alternatives in the form of a moisture balance. Moisture balances don't always meet USP guidelines, but they're very commonly validated by individual companies as a rapid alternative. So whether you're thinking about getting into using a rapid alternative, or if you're already using a moisture balance and want to evaluate whether or not you've got the right fit, here are a few things that you should consider when looking at rapid alternatives. So, general overview of rapid loss on drying analyzers. So they typically consist of a heat source and a balance to measure initial and final weight. So that is moisture balance in its most basic form. There are a lot of different models available, but not all of them are built equally. So that's why we'll go through some questions for you to ask yourself and to consider when looking at moisture balances. So the first question to ask, do I have good temperature control? As we discussed in the risks, it's very important to make sure you're drying at the right temperature, so you're driving off all of the volatile components you want to drive off without burning the sample. The other question is, how good is the balance I'm using? Probably the most expensive component in any loss on drying analyzer is the balance. Typically, the price of the unit is directly comparable to the quality of that balance. So you want to make sure you have a good quality balance that's going to take good readings. Next, do I have to operate inside a fume hood? So you need to look at what kind of samples you're running, if there are any risks to personnel, if those vapors are released into the laboratory. So most loss on drying instruments do not have active ventilation, so you got to consider where you're going to place that moisture balance. Next thing to consider is how easy is that unit to operate. The reason we go to these rapid alternatives is to make things faster and easier. So if you can pick one that you find easy to use, then that's one thing to consider. The next question to ask yourself, how long will this test take? So if you're buying a rapid moisture analyzer, you're probably trying to save some time. So most analyzers will take the time down from maybe 4 to 8 hours to somewhere less than an hour. But with that moisture balance, you got to ask yourself, how much time are you saving? And you really want to look at those time savings. Finally, will the analyzer be used on the production floor? And if so, is it rugged enough? So you want to consider where this moisture balance is going to be placed and whether the environment you're placing it in is suitable for long-term use. In a few minutes, I'll share with you a study conducted at CEM that compares the performance of CEM's Smart Q moisture analyzer, which is shown here. Once you've asked yourself some basic questions about what the needs of your labs are, you should consider what differentiates analyzers that are good from those that are just okay. Since this talk is focused on safety, I'll focus on a few safety features that you should look for in a loss on drying analyzer. So, some things to look for, some things that will add some safety to loss on drying is flame detect. If a sample overheats for some reason, if something goes wrong, if a flame is generated, will your instrument detect that flame and alert you to that? The next is a sealed cavity. So sealed cavity, that performs two functions. In the case of something like a flame being detected, that sealed cavity can have all ventilation cut off, will smother any potential fire and self-correct. More commonly though, that active ventilation aids in drying, so it's pulling volatile components off of the sample as they are volatilized, so it gives you a much faster test, but also with active ventilation, you're able to route those vapors where you want to, so you can operate outside of a fume hood if you want. And lastly, in terms of safety, is sample temperature control. So one thing to look at is whether or not the unit you're considering is measuring the temperature of the cavity or of the sample. And that's important because a lot of times during the warm-up period, a moisture balance may be using full power to heat the cavity up while that sample is being overheated, which can lead to burning. So if you have direct sample temperature control, you're able to control the amount of energy being put into that sample and make sure that it never overheats. Another key to a good loss on drying analyzer, as I touched on earlier, is the balance. So if you're looking for accuracy, a good four-place analytical balance really is required. Along with accuracy, precise temperature control of the sample. Again, that will make sure that the sample is properly dried and that you'll get good results. And finally, if you're doing constant weight determination, you want to make sure you have adjustable sensitivity so you can adjust that sensitivity to meet your needs and make sure you're meeting the right criteria for constant weight. Finally, the last key to a good loss on drying analyzer is ease of use. We live in the modern day and everybody has a smartphone with a touch screen in their pocket. So everybody is very comfortable with the use of touch screens. So a good loss on drying analyzer should have an easy to use touchscreen interface. It should also have automatic data export to LIMS. This is important since you're generating data directly with the balance. You should be able to export that data easily. Then also you should have the option for a printout of that data. Even though we are in the digital world, a lot of times hard copies are still required. So if you can print out a hard copy at the time of the test, that will make your life a whole lot easier. As I mentioned, we did a study here at CEM. It was a comparison between the Smart Q infrared moisture analyzer and a draft oven. So we compared some results from various samples to USP 731 reference method. In this study, we chose 5 sample types and we compared them to reference results. The average difference between the Smart Q and the air oven was about 0.003%. And I should mention that the Smart Q average test time was 5 minutes with no cavity preheat. We did the same comparison using a number of other brands of high-end moisture balances. I won't name any names, but we did find that the average test time on some of these other loss on drying analyzers without active ventilation were about 15 minutes, and the results weren't quite as accurate or repeatable. Let's look at the reproducibility or the precision of the Smart Q. So here are each of the individual 5 replicates, and we can see here standard deviations are very low. On average, they're less than 0.015%. So we've got good accuracy and good reproducibility, and all doing this in about 5 minutes. So just a quick comparison of rapid loss on drying analyzers. So if we're looking at the Smart Q versus other moisture balances, the main thing to look at is it direct? That's sort of the nature of all infrared moisture balances, so that's something you get with any unit. But with the Smart Q, there are some safety features built in: the active cavity ventilation, the direct sample temperature monitoring, so make sure that we have a safe way to run that sample. It's also a little bit faster, so we got 5 minutes versus 15 to 20 with other infrared moisture balances. The accuracy, we found Smart Q to be as accurate as reference method. Depending on the unit, some of the other infrared moisture balances may be accurate as well, but really you got to look out for what balance do you have, how accurate is it, what's that quality of data you're getting from that balance. And lastly, ease of use. Smart Q's got that touch screen, very easy to use. You can train anybody in 5 or 10 minutes and be up and running. So just to summarize some of the things we've talked about today, with the right setup, you can improve safety in your lab for both loss on drying and loss on ignition, and you can do that without sacrificing data quality. Automated sulfated ash that will simplify the ashing process for you and reduces some of those risky steps, such as the pre-char step required in traditional sulfated ash methods. And finally, automated loss on drying can streamline your testing and provides you with good data traceability.